October 4th, 1997. Charlotte, North Carolina. A city known for banking, church bells, and Southern charm. But that night, it became the stage for one of the most bizarre and outrageous crimes in U.S. history. A staggering $17.9 million vanished from the Loomis Fargo armored car vault in a single night. To this day, it remains the second largest cash heist ever on American soil. What makes this story so unbelievable isn't just the amount of money stolen, it's who pulled it off. This wasn't the work of elite bank robbers or masterminds who had been planning for years. Instead, it was a group of everyday people, an armored car driver, his crush from work, and a greedy couple with big dreams but little sense. Unfueled by love, lust, and the promise of easy riches, they thought they had struck gold. But greed has a way of unraveling even the best-laid plans. What began as a fantasy quickly spiraled into paranoia, betrayal, and an FBI manhunt. This is the story of the Loomis Fargo heist, how a simple crush and a reckless plan turned into an $18 million disaster that shocked the nation. David Gant was not your typical criminal. A Gulf War veteran, he worked long hours as a vault supervisor at Loomis Fargo. His job was simple: oversee millions in cash and make sure it was counted, secured, and transported safely. Day in and day out, he handled money most people couldn't even dream of holding. Yet David himself lived a modest paycheck-to-paycheck life in Gastonia, North Carolina. But there was one thing that lit up his world. Kelly Campbell, a fellow Loomis employee. Kelly was different, fun, bold, and just a little rebellious. David, already in a troubled marriage, found himself drawn to her. To him, Kelly wasn't just a coworker. She was excitement, freedom, maybe even love. Kelly, on the other hand, saw something else in David: opportunity. She confided in him, hinting at her dissatisfaction with her own life and money struggles. Over drinks one evening, she planted the idea that would change everything. Why not take some of it? You've got the keys to the vault, David. You're practically sitting on a fortune every night. At first, David laughed it off. But as days passed, the thought gnawed at him. He wasn't a crook, but he was desperate for money, for a new life, and most of all, for Kelly's attention. Kelly knew David was hooked, but she also knew they couldn't pull this off alone. That's when she reconnected with an old friend, Steve Chambers. Steve wasn't just a small-time hustler. He was someone always scheming for the big score. He had charm, ambition, and a dangerous kind of greed that made him believe he was smarter than everyone else. Kelly introduced Steve to David, and soon, the trio was meeting in secret. The plan sounded simple enough. David would use his position to load the Loomis van with as much cash as possible, drive it to a safe house, and split the loot. Steve assured them it was foolproof. The company was sloppy with security. The vaults held more cash than anyone could track in a single night. And with David's access, there wouldn't even need to be forced entry. Still, details needed ironing out. They had to figure out where to stash millions of dollars in bills, literally tons of cash. Steve suggested they use a mobile home as a temporary stash spot. They talked about alibis, timing, and even getaway routes. For David, this was more than money. It was the chance to escape his old life, run away with Kelly, and finally live the adventure he thought she promised. But for Steve, it was all about the payday. And unlike David, Steve had no intention of playing fair. October 4th, 1997. David arrived for his shift at Loomis Fargo like it was any other night. But this time, he stayed late after his coworkers left. His heart pounded as he wheeled cart after cart of cash toward the armored van parked outside. The money was everywhere, bundled stacks of 20s, 50s, and hundreds. By the end of it, the van was so full that he could barely close the doors. Altogether, David had loaded 2,800 pounds of cash, nearly $18 million. Every second was being recorded by security cameras. David knew it, but in the heat of the moment, he didn't care. He had convinced himself this was the start of his new life. He drove out of the parking lot, the van sagging under the weight of millions. At the safe house, Steve and Kelly were waiting. They unloaded the bins into a storage shed, piling them high like something out of a movie. For a brief moment, they celebrated, laughing, drinking, and swimming in piles of money. But reality set in quickly. The sheer volume of bills was overwhelming. They had to work fast to stash it all before anyone noticed. By dawn, Loomis Fargo discovered the missing van. Within hours, the FBI was notified. The largest cash robbery in North Carolina's history had just been pulled off by an inside man. The morning after, the heist crew was running on adrenaline and fear. Steve, ever the self-proclaimed mastermind, laid out the next phase. David, he insisted, had to disappear. If investigators came knocking, he'd be the first suspect. David agreed. With Kelly's encouragement, he packed a bag and headed south. Steve handed him $50,000 in cash, barely a fraction of his share, and told him to hide in Mexico until the heat cooled down. David trusted Kelly. He believed she would join him soon, and together, they'd start fresh. What he didn't realize was that Kelly had no intention of running away with him. She and Steve were already making plans to keep the lion's share of the loot. Meanwhile, Steve and his wife, Michelle, got busy hiding millions. They crammed bills into garbage bags, dug shallow holes, and even stuffed cash into barrels. But the more they hid, the more reckless they became. David crossed into Mexico, settling in Cozumel. At first, it felt like paradise, sun, beaches, and the dream of Kelly arriving any day. But weeks passed and loneliness set in. He had money, but not enough to survive long term. Worse, he was stranded depending on Steve for wire transfers. Back in Charlotte, suspicion was already growing. How could David, a vault supervisor with access to millions, vanish the very night nearly $18 million disappeared? The walls were closing in. Back in North Carolina, Steve and Michelle Chambers quickly abandoned caution. With duffel bags of cash at their disposal, they started living like millionaires. They bought luxury cars outright, paid cash for jewelry, and even purchased a sprawling mansion in one of Charlotte's most expensive neighborhoods. Their sudden wealth raised eyebrows. Neighbors who knew Steve as a struggling small-time hustler couldn't understand how he suddenly had more money than a lottery winner. Rumors spread quickly, and before long, people were whispering to authorities. But Steve didn't care. He was intoxicated by power and cash. He filled his house with extravagant furniture, threw lavish parties, and made no effort to keep a low profile. Michelle flaunted designer clothes and diamonds. They seemed to think the FBI wouldn't notice. Meanwhile, David was stranded in Mexico, surviving off small wire transfers Steve reluctantly sent. He grew frustrated and lonely, wondering why Kelly hadn't joined him. For David, the money was supposed to buy freedom and love. For Steve, it was a one-way ticket to greed and arrogance. The cracks were showing. Friends noticed, neighbors noticed, and most importantly, the FBI noticed. The so-called perfect crime was starting to unravel. The FBI took control of the investigation within hours of the robbery. From the start, David Gant was their prime suspect. The security footage showed him loading the van, his face clear as day. But what baffled investigators was, where had the money gone? They followed the trail, beginning with David's sudden disappearance. His wife claimed she didn't know where he was, but his co-workers pointed to his close friendship with Kelly Campbell. Soon, Kelly's phone records connected her to Steve Chambers, and the circle was complete. But the real break came from the Chambers lifestyle. Within weeks of the heist, the couple had gone from broke to flush with cash. They bought a house worth hundreds of thousands in cash, drew attention with luxury cars, and even deposited large amounts of bills at local banks. The FBI placed them under surveillance. Wiretaps captured conversations that revealed paranoia, greed, and a growing divide between Steve, Kelly, and David in Mexico. Agents monitored every move, waiting for the moment to strike. And when Steve began boasting to friends about easy money, investigators knew they had more than enough to close in. The net was tightening. As the FBI closed in, tension within the group hit a breaking point. Steve Chambers grew increasingly paranoid about David. After all, David was sitting in Mexico, broke, desperate, and possibly ready to cut a deal. No, Steve told associates he wanted David taken care of. He even discussed hiring a hitman to silence him permanently. What Steve didn't know was that the FBI had already tapped his phone. Every word was recorded. Meanwhile, David was still clinging to the hope that Kelly would join him. But she was already cooperating with Steve, helping funnel money and keeping David on the hook with promises. By early 1998, investigators had gathered enough evidence to move in. In March, David was arrested in Mexico. He surrendered quietly, almost relieved that his lonely nightmare was ending. Soon after, FBI agents raided the Chambers mansion and hauled Steve, Michelle, and Kelly into custody. What began as a love-fueled fantasy had collapsed into betrayal, greed, and federal charges. The trials that followed painted the crew as both greedy and foolish. Prosecutors argued this wasn't a brilliant heist. It was a sloppy inside job that unraveled almost immediately. David Gaunt admitted his role, telling the court he did it for love and the dream of a better life. His honesty earned him some leniency, but he still received a 7-year prison sentence. Steve Chambers, the so-called mastermind, was hit hardest. The judge handed him 11 years behind bars. Michelle, Kelly, and over 20 accomplices faced sentences ranging from a few months to several years. In the end, investigators recovered most of the money, but over $2 million remains missing to this day, fueling endless speculation about whether someone managed to hide a secret stash. The Loomis Fargo heist went down not as the perfect crime, but as a cautionary tale of greed, betrayal, and arrogance. The $18 million Loomis Fargo heist was never about brilliance. It was about ordinary people blinded by greed and love, who thought they could rewrite their futures with stolen cash. Instead, they ended up with broken lives and years behind bars. It's proof that crime doesn't just fail because of police work. It fails because greed always eats itself alive. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more true crime documentaries.